As we all know, emperors tend to have mistresses. It's not exclusive to one country or time period, but it's only in ancient China where they are known as concubines, a unique term with a special meaning. Empress Dowager Cixi, the de facto ruler of late Qing dynasty China, had 6 imperial concubines. 5 of them were selected by her husband, Emperor Tongzi, and the last one was bestowed upon him by his father, the Shanfeng Emperor. These women came from different backgrounds. But once inside the Forbidden City walls, they all became equal, at least in theory. In fact, that is not quite true, because there were some rules that governed how imperial concubines should behave. Today, let's talk about what these rules were and find out if they were actually followed. Did these women really live as sisters? In ancient China, there were 2 types of imperial mistresses. One was the concubine, and the other was the consort. While both served the emperor in the same capacity, they had different levels of importance. Concubines were usually younger and unmarried women who were taken into the palace to bear the emperor children. They could be promoted to the rank of consort after giving birth to an heir. And consorts were usually older and more experienced women who were chosen for their intelligence and ability to manage a household. Both concubines and consorts lived in the same compound, but they were generally kept separate from each other. This helps to maintain order in the harem and prevent jealousy and conflict among the women. The rules governing the behavior of concubines and consorts were extremely strict. They were expected to follow a strict code of etiquette at all times, and any infraction could result in their banishment from the palace. For example, they were not allowed to show any emotion in public, and they had to curtsy to show respect to the emperor. They were also forbidden from eating or drinking before the emperor, and they had to sleep in separate rooms from him. Despite these restrictions, though, life as a concubine or consort was still considered highly desirable by many Chinese women. After all, it meant living in the lap of luxury and having the chance to serve the most powerful man in the country. Now let's talk about the 6 imperial concubines of Empress Dowager Cixi. They are Li Yu, Jin Yubin, An, Gairin, Zhao Shen, Fu Jin, Zhao Jia, Yu Rong, and Ma Jia. Most of them had humble beginnings, which is typical for those who entered the Forbidden City through the concubine entrance. Concubine Li Yu was probably the most famous of the bunch, and she eventually rose to become the most senior consort in the palace. Born in 1845, Li Yu was the daughter of a Han Chinese merchant and was selected by Emperor Tongzi to be his concubine in 1860. She bore him 3 children, Ku, 2 daughters and a son, and was promoted to the rank of noble consort Li after the birth of her first child. Li Yu was known for her intelligence and wit, and she was also very close to the Shanfeng Emperor, who helped her navigate the treacherous waters of court politics. After Tongzi's death, she became the favorite concubine of the new emperor, Guangxu, and continued to wield considerable power until her death in 1908. Jin Yubin was another important imperial concubine of the Qing dynasty. She was born in 1847 and was the daughter of a Mongol prince. She was taken into the Forbidden City when she was just 13 years old and became the favorite concubine of Emperor Tongzi. Although she did not have any children, she remained in the good graces of the emperor until his death. Jin Yubin was a talented musician, and she was said to have been particularly fond of playing the pipa, a traditional Chinese instrument. She was also well versed in poetry and calligraphy, and was considered to be a cultured woman. Then we have Gairin, who was born in 1849 and was the daughter of a Manchu noble. She was taken into the Forbidden City as a concubine when she was just 14 years old and was one of the favorites of the Shanfeng Emperor. Although she did not have any children, she was well liked by the royal family and was known for her intelligence and quick wit. After the death of the Shanfeng Emperor, she became a concubine of Tongzi and then Guangxu. Zhao Shen was born in 1852 and was the daughter of an ordinary Chinese peasant. She was taken into the Forbidden City as a concubine when she was just 17 years old. In 1872, she gave birth to a daughter, Princess Chen, who would later become the Empress of the Guangxu Emperor. This made Zhao Chen the only concubine of Tongzi to give birth to a child who would continue the Qing dynasty bloodline. Despite this accomplishment, though, Zhao Chen was not particularly well treated by the other concubines, and was often ignored by the emperor. She died in 1881 without any fanfare. Concubine Fu Jin was born in 1854, and was the daughter of a Manchu noble. She was taken into the Forbidden City as a concubine when she was just 15 years old. She was one of the favorites of the Tongzi Emperor and was known for her beauty and grace. However, she was also very vain, and this caused problems with the other concubines. In 1874, she was caught trying to steal jewelry from another concubine and was banished from the palace. Concubine Zhao Jia was born in 1856 and was the daughter of a Han Chinese merchant. She was taken into the Forbidden City as a concubine when she was just 14 years old. She was known for her intelligence and quick wit, and was also very close to the Empress Dowager Cixi. After the death of Tongzi, she became a concubine of Guangxu, but she was banished from the palace in 1889 after being accused of plotting against Cixi. Lastly, we have concubine Yurong, who was born in 1860 and was the daughter of a Mongol prince. She was taken into the Forbidden City when she was just 10 years old and was the only concubine of Tongzi to survive into adulthood. After his death, she became a concubine of Guangxu and then Shanfang, and she lived in the Forbidden City until her death in 1915. From the list of concubines, we can see that most of them had humble beginnings and were not related to the royal family. Also, most of them were taken into the Forbidden City when they were very young, like in their early teens. At that age, they were referred to as maidens. As for their personal lives, some of them were favored by the emperors, while others were not. But in general, they lived luxurious lives and had access to fine clothing and jewelry. When they were not busy entertaining the emperor or his guests, they practiced their various feminine skills, such as singing, dancing, and playing instruments. They were also expected to keep up with court gossip and be knowledgeable about current events. In addition, they had to observe the rules of the harem at all times. This included curtsying to show respect to the emperor and his family, never eating or drinking before him, and sleeping in separate rooms from him. The punishment for breaking the rules could be severe, ranging from a verbal or physical reprimand to banishment from the palace. Despite the strict rules, life as a concubine or consort was still considered highly desirable by many Chinese women. The perks were just too good to pass up, even if it meant giving up one's freedom and dignity. Now let's talk about whether these women actually lived as sisters. The answer is yes and no. On one hand, they all shared the same living quarters and were technically under the same boss. So in that sense, they were like sisters. On the other hand, they were all competing for the emperor's favor, and there was a lot of jealousy and backstabbing going on, so maybe not so much like sisters. Ultimately, it depends on how you define the term. But if you ask me, I would say that they were more like business partners than sisters. They all had their own goals and ambitions, and they were willing to do whatever it took to achieve them, even if it meant betraying one another. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please hit the like button and subscribe so you and miss out on any of my future videos. See you next time. When you think of the Victorian era, what comes to mind? For me, it's corsets and crinolines, horse-drawn carriages, and oh yes, those fabulous hats. But it was also a time when women were fighting for their very survival, trying to escape an unwanted marriage or attempting to earn a living in a man's world, and it wasn't just the women who were keeping secrets. Some men had illegitimate children with their mistresses, while others struggled with same-sex attraction in a society that could brand them criminals. Today, we are uncovering the hidden lives of the mistresses of the Victorian era. A mistress was a woman who had a romantic or sexual relationship with a man who was usually married, but not always. The term mistress did not carry the same stigma in Victorian times as it does today. In fact, many respectable families would accept a long-term mistress if she met certain criteria. She must be unmarried, preferably of good social standing, and able to provide companionship for their bachelor male relative. This was called a companionate relationship, and these relationships often lasted for years. The mistress was expected to live separately from the man and his family. And should she become pregnant, he would usually provide financial support for her and the child. A daughter born out of wedlock would often be legitimized by her father. That is, he would acknowledge her as his in official documents. This gave her the right to inherit property and titles, and crucially saved her from the stigma of being an illegitimate child. One famous mistress during the Victorian era was Louise von der Tan, who lived with German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck was known as the Iron Chancellor, and it was thanks to Louise that he was given this nickname. When Louise entered Bismarck's life, he was already married, but his wife had long since left him. Louise, like all mistresses, had a difficult task, keeping a low profile while making sure her needs were met. In 1862, Bismarck's friend told him, "You can't go on like this. You're giving rise to malicious gossip." Bismarck replied, "I can't help it. She has such a charming way of forcing herself upon my attention." While it sounds like Louise may have been needy and demanding, this story goes to show that it was not uncommon for a mistress to exert control in her relationship. Often they were younger and more attractive than the male partner and knew how to use their allure to their advantage. 8. This was certainly the case with Helen Viallen Gordon, who had an affair with British Prime Minister Lord Melbourne. Helen was only 17 when she first met the Prime Minister and immediately caught his eye with her wit and beauty. Their affair lasted for several years and was well known in London society. However, it was kept secret from Melbourne's wife and daughters. Like some other mistresses, Helen was not shy about flaunting her relationship with the Prime Minister. She wore expensive clothes and jewelry and drove around London in a fine carriage. She even had a portrait painted of her and hung it in her bedroom. Helen was confident that Melbourne would leave his wife for her, but he never did. Eventually, Helen grew tired of waiting and began seeing other men. When Melbourne found out, he ended their relationship and she was forced to leave London. Helen tried to make a comeback and wrote a novel based on her experiences with Melbourne. But it was not well received, and she died believing herself to be a failure. Not all mistresses were so brazen, however. Many kept their heads down and tried to avoid any scandal. But sometimes scandal found them anyway. In the case of Emma Dan, her relationship with poet Alfred Tennyson was a secret only because Emma was his sister-in-law. Emma was the sister of Tennyson's wife and moved in with the couple after her husband's death. Soon rumors began circulating about her inappropriate relationship with her brother-in-law. These rumors were fueled by the fact that Emma and Alfred exchanged very affectionate letters, even though both of them were married. It's unclear whether or not they actually had a physical relationship, but that didn't stop people from talking. To protect his reputation, Alfred began to avoid Emma, and eventually she moved out of his house. She lived the rest of her life as a recluse, never marrying again. While some mistresses were able to maintain a high social standing, others were not so fortunate. Servants were often treated as second-class citizens in Victorian England. They lived in cramped conditions and were expected to work long hours for very little pay. They also had little access to education or healthcare. But perhaps the worst part of being a servant was the constant threat of being accused of theft. Servants were routinely accused of stealing from their employers, and if found guilty, were often punished severely, including being sent to prison. One woman who was wrongly accused of theft was Ruth Olden, a servant who was convicted in 1864, stealing a shawl worth 45 pounds. At her trial, the evidence against her was weak, but she was convicted nonetheless and sentenced to 6 months in prison. While in prison, Ruth met another woman who had been accused of stealing jewelry from her employer. The two women became friends, and after they were released from prison, they decided to team up and rob a house together. They were soon caught and both sentenced to death. Ruth was hanged in 1861 at the age of 23. Her story is a reminder of the harsh realities faced by servants in Victorian England. But it wasn't just servants who were vulnerable to accusations of theft. In 1862, a woman named Mary Jane Kelly became the last mistress of infamous killer Jack the Ripper. Jack murdered at least 5 women in the Whitechapel district of London. And although he was never caught, the police suspected that he had a mistress who helped him dispose of the bodies. Mary Jane fit the description of one of Jack's victims, but she was never charged with any crime. However, the police continued to harass her, accusing her of being a prostitute and a thief. Eventually, Mary Jane was arrested for stealing a handkerchief from a house where she had worked as a servant. She was convicted and sentenced to 6 months in prison. While in prison, she gave birth to a baby girl who was put up for adoption. After her release, Mary Jane tried to start a new life, but she was haunted by her past. She died in poverty in 1906. As we can see, the life of a mistress was not always easy. While some mistresses enjoyed the finer things in life, others had to fight for their very survival. These women were often caught in a dangerous game of cat and mouse with the police, who were trying to shut down prostitution in London. If they were caught, they could be arrested for prostitution or for stealing. And if they were lucky enough to escape arrest, they still had to deal with the stigma of being an outcast from Victorian society. There were many men in Victorian England who had illegitimate children with prostitutes, but few of them were willing to acknowledge these children publicly. The most famous Victorian man who had illegitimate children with prostitutes was King Edward VII. He had at least 3 illegitimate children during his lifetime and made sure that they were well taken care of financially. He also ensured that they were kept out of the public eye as much as possible. One of his illegitimate sons, born out of an affair with a music hall singer, was given the title Lord Lucas and went on to have a successful career in the military. His other illegitimate son, born out of an affair with a prostitute, was given the title Viscount Tredegar and became a well-known dandy and racehorse owner.
Honor King.
Most men who had children with prostitutes did everything they could to hide it from society. They often paid the mother of the child a small sum of money and then sent her away to have the baby. Once the child was born, they either put it up for adoption or, in the case of a daughter, legitimized her so that she could inherit property and titles. It's important to note that not all Victorians accepted this practice, however. Many people, especially women, saw it as a way for men to take advantage of women and get away with it without any consequences. The double standards of Victorian society are evident in the fact that a woman who had sex with a man outside of marriage was stigmatized and shunned, while the man was seen as a hero. To learn more about the shocking ways that women were punished for having sex before marriage, stay tuned for our upcoming videos on Victorian slut-shaming. We'll explore how women were publicly shamed and punished for having sex before marriage, through public shaming, forced marriage, and even genital mutilation. Imagine it's 1888 London. You're a young woman with dreams of finding love and starting a family. But there's a catch. Your father has forbidden you from marrying beneath his social standing. So when you meet the charming and dashing artist living below your station, you must choose between following your heart and societal expectations. What would you do? Hi, I'm here to talk about the lives of Victorian mistresses. We often think of the past through rose-colored glasses. A time of romance and chivalry, beautiful music and art. The Victorian era was undoubtedly a time of great literature, sweeping social reforms, groundbreaking scientific discoveries, not to mention iconic fashion. For many of us, the Victorian era represents an idyllic time in history. For those who lived through it, however, life during Queen Victoria's reign could be quite challenging, especially for women. While the era is synonymous with childbearing and domesticity, some women found alternative paths to happiness, whether by choice or circumstance. This is the story of one such woman, a mistress in Victorian England. It all started with Thomas. He was an artist known for his unique style of painting vivid scenes from everyday life. His paintings were in high demand, and he was well paid for them. It made him rather wealthy for a working man, but not rich enough to care for a wife and children. However, when he met Amelia at the age of 24, he knew he wanted to settle down and start a family with her. There was just one problem. Her father disapproved. He didn't know Thomas very well, and he was unsure if he was good enough for his little girl. See, Amelia's father was a successful businessman, and he wanted more for his daughter than a life of domesticity. In fact, he had already found a suitable suitor for her, a wealthy landowner named Lord Frederick Altrincham. On one crisp autumn afternoon, Mr. Altrincham came to call. He was tall and handsome, with a neatly trimmed beard and a confident air about him. Everything, according to society, that Amelia should look for in a husband. Her father, overjoyed at the prospect of an advantageous match, threw a grand party to celebrate their engagement. But Amelia's heart wasn't in it. She couldn't help but think of Thomas and the life they could have shared. As the weeks went by, her feelings for Thomas only grew stronger. She found herself sneaking out of her house to meet him in secret. They would walk for hours together, talking about their hopes and dreams for the future. When Amelia confessed her undying love for Thomas, he admitted that he loved her too, but felt that he wasn't worthy of her. "I may love you," he said, "but you are a diamond, and I am but a pebble on the road." Undeterred, Amelia decided to elope with Thomas, leaving behind her old life and everything her father had planned for her. They settled in a small cottage on the outskirts of town, where they lived happily for several years. Amelia gave birth to 2 beautiful children, a boy and a girl, and Thomas was a devoted father. He painted their portraits, which hung proudly on the walls of their home. One day, tragedy struck. Amelia fell ill and died. Thomas, heartbroken, continued to live in the cottage with his 2 children. Years passed, and his children grew up happy and healthy, and one day his son came down with a fever and died. Thomas, devastated, sent his daughter away to live with relatives, so that he wouldn't be alone. He continued to paint until his eyesight failed him, and then he died peacefully in his sleep. When his daughter returned from France to settle her father's estate, she found his final masterpiece, a self-portrait of her father and mother, side by side with their 2 children. On the back of the painting, he had written, "In this world we are all but pilgrims traveling the same path. We come, we see, we conquer, and then we are gone." What a great story, right? It might seem like a sad Victorian sob story, but the reality was much different. The truth was that Amelia ran off with a man who was poor and uneducated, abandoned her 2 children, and ended up dying alone in a cottage. Now let me be clear, I'm not judging Amelia here. She made choices based on the circumstances she found herself in. And at the end of the day, she was just trying to find happiness. However, it's important to remember that the Victorian era was a time when women were expected to be submissive and obedient to their fathers or husbands. If you were an unmarried woman and found yourself pregnant, you were likely to be shunned by society and have a difficult time finding work. This is why most women who became pregnant outside of marriage during this time period chose to keep their babies and raise them as their own, even if it meant sacrificing their own happiness. However, not all women were willing to accept this fate. Some, like Amelia, chose to fight against the constraints of Victorian society. Others found ways to make money without compromising their values. These women were known as independent women, and they were a rare breed during the Victorian era. But how did they manage to survive in a society that was so hostile to women? One way that some women managed to survive in Victorian England was by relying on their wits and their charm. They may have started out as servants, but quickly moved up the social ladder to become governesses or companions to wealthy families. As governesses, they were responsible for the education of the children of wealthy families. This was a respectable position, but it also came with a lot of responsibility. Governesses were expected to not only teach their pupils the 3 R's, but also to instill in them the values and manners of their social class. Being a companion to a wealthy woman meant providing emotional support and companionship, as well as helping with household tasks. This was a more intimate relationship, and companions were often privy to the private thoughts and feelings of their employers. Another way that women managed to survive in Victorian England was by starting their own businesses. This was a risky venture, as women were not always allowed to own property or enter into contracts. However, some women were able to overcome these obstacles and launch successful businesses. Some of these businesses catered to the needs of other women, such as dressmaking or millinery. Others, such as printing or publishing, were more traditional male domains. But no matter what industry they were in, these women were trailblazers, paving the way for future generations of female entrepreneurs. And let's not forget the women who simply refused to conform to the expectations of Victorian society. They may not have had much money, but they were rich in spirit and determination. They dressed in a way that defied the constrictive fashions of the time, and they spoke their minds freely, no matter the consequences. These women were true rebels, and they helped to pave the way for the women's rights movement that would gain steam in the early 20th century. Life for women in Victorian England was not easy. But despite the hardships they faced, many women were able to find ways to carve out a life for themselves. Whether they were independent business owners, governesses, companions, or simply rebels. These women were trailblazers who helped to break down the barriers that had been erected for them. In doing so, they set the stage for future generations of women to fight for their rights and equality. So the next time you think of the Victorian era, don't just picture the beautiful dresses and the horse-drawn carriages. Remember the strong, independent women who were alive during that time. Women like Amelia, who dared to dream of a better life for themselves, no matter the cost. Thank you for watching. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more content. Also check out these other videos, which I think you'll really enjoy. The woman who took down a king, King Edward VIII of England, decided to abdicate the throne in 1936. He left behind a lot of people scratching their heads. Why would a man who had waited his entire life to become king suddenly decide not to? It was an unprecedented move that left his family and the entire country confused and angry. But there was one person who was very happy about this turn of events: Edward's former mistress, and she knew exactly how to manipulate the king into doing what she wanted. So who was this woman? What did she have on Edward? And why is she considered the woman who took down a king? Let's find out. Chapter 1. A Royal Heartbreaker. Edward, the future king, first met Wallis Simpson at a party in 1918 when they both happened to be single. She was the daughter of an American millionaire and a British aristocrat. Her father had died when she was just 2 years old, and her mother remarried a viscount, giving Wallis a stepmother. Despite coming from a wealthy family, Wallis was not taken seriously by high society, because she had a reputation for being a little too forward with her advances towards men. She also had a taste for fast cars and fast living, which made her stand out in the crowd. At the party, Edward was immediately smitten with Wallis and began flirting with her constantly. While she seemed to enjoy the attention at first, it didn't take long for her to grow tired of his advances. Perhaps she was already playing some kind of game with the prince and she intended to lead him on before striking. Whatever the case may be, after rejecting his advances, Edward found himself growing more and more obsessed with her, to the point where he even started stalking her. He would wait outside her house, hoping to catch a glimpse of her or have a brief conversation. But then something interesting happened. Wallis moved out of her family home and into a hotel, and she brought along her mother and her 2 young children, which further confused the prince. You see, Wallis was already married to a man named Ernest Aldrich Simpson. However, they had been separated for over 10 years, and all signs pointed towards a divorce. Now, while this fact alone might make Edward think that pursuing Wallis would be okay, it didn't. In fact, Edward was so infatuated with her that he didn't care if she was married. He ended up moving into the same hotel as Wallis, but not in the same room. Rather, he rented a room across the hall from hers, perhaps thinking that being so close to her was enough. At the time, this was scandalous gossip news, but nothing had happened yet that would indicate the drama that would unfold soon. Chapter 2. A Secret Tryst. After staying in the same hotel as Wallis for some time, Edward could no longer contain his desire to be near her. He started visiting her room in the middle of the night, and they engaged in a romantic relationship, despite her being a married woman. It was a risky move, but Wallis wasn't afraid of anything. However, during one of Edward's late-night visits, they were caught in the act by none other than Wallis's husband, Ernest. To make things worse, he was a good friend of King George V, Edward's own father, and he was furious. Luckily for Edward, Ernest was not a violent man, but rather the opposite. He tried to reason with the prince, telling him that although he and Wallis were separated, she was still his wife, and that Edward should back off. As expected, the prince didn't listen and continued seeing Wallis in secret, perhaps believing that he would eventually marry her. Yet Edward was not the only one to blame here. Wallis also played a part in this, as she led him on and never tried to set boundaries. Even though they were having an affair, she still spent time with other men, and Edward couldn't do anything about it. Chapter 3. Caught between 2 lovers. Soon enough, word got around about Edward and Wallis's relationship, and the king was furious. He summoned his son to his study and told him that he needed to end things with Wallis once and for all. Not only because she was married, but also because their relationship was making him look bad. The king demanded that Edward move out of the hotel and stay away from Wallis from now on. But this proved difficult, as Edward was completely in love with the woman and couldn't imagine his life without her. So instead of listening to his father, he decided to ignore him and continue seeing Wallis. This caused a rift between Edward and the king, and the prince's relationship with the rest of his family also began to deteriorate. In fact, his brother George, Duke of Kent, confronted him about his behavior and warned him that he could jeopardize the entire British monarchy if he continued seeing Wallace. The pressure was mounting, and it seemed like Edward would eventually have to choose between his love for Wallace and his royal duties. But instead, he chose neither. Chapter 4. An Unlikely Escape. It seems that Edward was simply biding his time until he could officially break away from his royal duties and be with Wallace without anyone looking down on them. This moment came sooner than anyone would have expected. As King George V died in January of 1936, with his father out of the picture, Edward finally became king and was free to make his own decisions. His first official act as king was to invite Wallace and her mother to Buckingham Palace, where they stayed for a month. The people were outraged and saw Wallace as a gold digger who had used Edward to get to the throne. Then came the final blow, the one that truly established Wallace as the woman who took down a king. Just 3 months after ascending to the throne, Edward abdicated and gave up his position to marry Wallace. It was an unprecedented event that shocked the entire world, as no one could believe that a king would willingly give up his position. The Prime Minister at the time, Stanley Baldwin, urged Edward to reconsider his decision, but the king was adamant. He stated that he could not fulfill his royal duties unless he was free to marry Wallace. Therefore, he was willing to give up the throne if he could not have her. And so, on December 11, 1936, Edward VIII signed the Instruments of Abdication, officially giving up his position as king. He was succeeded by his younger brother, George VI, who was baffled by Edward's decision. Everyone was angry at Wallace, blaming her for manipulating the king into giving up. But the newly abdicated king didn't seem to mind. He married Wallace in a private ceremony, and they lived happily ever after, or at least that's what the newspapers said. In reality, their marriage was a disaster, as Wallace was far from the perfect woman. She had a terrible temper and often lashed out at Edward, causing physical fights. Their marriage was also plagued by financial problems, as Wallace was a notorious spender and always wanted more money. Eventually, Edward had to sign over all of his assets to her, leaving him penniless in his old age. He spent his remaining days bitter and alone, wishing he had never met Wallace. On the other hand, she enjoyed her wealth and status until her husband's death in 1972. After his passing, she was largely forgotten, and her story faded into obscurity. Chapter 5. Was she really the villain? While Wallace may have seemed like the obvious villain in this story, there's another perspective that is worth considering. Think about it. Edward was a grown man who had access to all the power and wealth in the world. He was also the King of England, a position that comes with a lot of perks. Yet he chose to ignore everyone around him, including his family and friends, and pursue a woman who was already married. He broke royal protocol and jeopardized the entire British monarchy just to be with Wallace. If he was willing to go that far, do you think that he would have listened to reason? Or was Wallace really the only person who could tame the wild prince? Perhaps Edward was tired of the constraints that came with his royal status, and he wanted to break free. He chose Wallace as his accomplice in this escape plan, and together they managed to bring down a king. But was it really a bad thing? Edward lived a life of luxury and comfort for the rest of his days. Although he had problems with Wallace, they were both happy to have each other. Ultimately, we may never know the truth behind the relationship between King Edward VIII and Wallace Simpson. But one thing is for sure, she will forever be remembered as the woman who took down a king. Now check out Who Shot Lincoln's Assassin, John Wilkes Booth, or watch the shocking true story of Lizzie Borden, the axe murderer. Who are some of the most powerful women in the mafia? And here is our list of mistresses of the mafia, women behind the criminal kings. Number 10, Giuseppina Palermo. The wife of the head of the Sicilian Mafia Commission, Bernardo Provenzano, was arrested in 2004 and was released from prison in 2013. She spent 9 years in jail after being found, guilty of helping her husband launder money and also for being an accomplice to several murders. She was tried in absentia because she refused to testify against her husband. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but was released early due to good behavior. When she left prison, she went to live with her son, who had become the boss of the mafia clan in the northern Italian city of Reggio Calabria. Her husband was known for his brutality, especially towards those who cooperated with police investigations. Giuseppe was killed in a hail of bullets outside his home in the Sicilian capital of Palermo. It was suspected that he was targeted by the police because of his high position in the mafia hierarchy. But this was never confirmed. His widow, however, had been charged with murder and other crimes. She testified against her own son to get a reduced sentence. Number 9. Maria Concetta Cocciola. Maria Concetta Cocciola became the most important boss in the mafia after the arrest of Bernardo Provenzano. Her son Matteo Messina Denaro is now considered to be the most powerful mafia boss in Italy. She has been described as cold-blooded, ruthless, but also very intelligent. This made her perfect for the job as a mafia boss. In 2009, she was arrested trying to enter Italy from Spain. This came after a 5-year hunt that involved over 400 police officers and agents. She had gone into hiding after her son became the target of a massive anti-mafia police operation. Her son was convicted of mafia association and was sentenced to 7 years in prison. However, he was able to avoid capture for almost a decade. His mother's arrest put an end to the myth that the mafia no longer exists. After all, how can an organization that has managed to survive for more than a century suddenly disappear? Even though she was a woman, police took her directly to prison instead of putting her in a women's prison. They decided to keep her in a men's prison because they were afraid that she could order a hit on them through her connections in the mafia. Number 8. Rita Teresa Di Matteo. This is the wife of Matteo Denaro, the current mafia boss of Sicily. She is said to have had plastic surgery to alter her appearance so that it would be harder for the police to recognize her if they saw her out in public. Like many wives of the mafia bosses, she enjoys a lavish lifestyle. And unlike many of these women, she is not afraid to flaunt her wealth. Rita likes to travel around Europe in private jets, stay at 5-star hotels, and drive luxury cars. She is also very active on social media, where she shares pictures of her expensive vacations and parties she attends. She is currently living in Germany under the Witness Protection Program, after her husband was finally arrested in 2021. Number 7. Anna Laura Pagano. This woman is the daughter of Cosimo Dottolion, who was the boss of one of the most powerful clans in the Naples area. She was indicted for mafia conspiracy charges, which is not surprising considering that her brother is also a member of the Camorra. She was accused of being an intermediary between the mafia and the construction industry. She helped her father obtain government contracts so that he could make millions of dollars in illegal profits. While the trial was going on, she gave birth to a baby boy, which made the judge delay sentencing her until the child was weaned. But even then, she was only given a suspended sentence and 6 months in prison. Since she already had a son, she probably didn't need any help getting pregnant again while in prison. Number 6. Francesca Fiorello. Francesca is the mother of the imprisoned mafia boss, Michele Greco. Her son was one of the most powerful bosses in the Sicilian mafia. He became the godfather of the mafia, and he took over his father's position after he died. But he was arrested in 1993 on charges of drug trafficking and murder. His mother, on the other hand, was never involved in the mafia and did not even know how her son got involved in it. That's why she was surprised when the police raided their house and arrested her son. She lived to the age of 95 and was still mourning her son's imprisonment when she passed away. Number 5. Bianca Bergoglio. She is the ex-wife of Sandro Trafficant, the former boss of the Genovese crime family. She worked as a secretary for her husband's lawyer and became an informant after he was arrested. She secretly recorded conversations between her husband and others and turned them over to the police. She even agreed to participate in a sting operation where she pretended to be interested in buying drugs from Colombia. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison but served only 2 years before being released. Early due to her cooperation with the police, she was granted immunity from prosecution in exchange for her testimony against her ex-husband. She played a key role in putting away several mobsters, including Anthony Fat Tony Dukes and Joseph Massino. She continues to live in New York City under the Witness Protection Program. Number 4. Carmen D'Amico. She was married to the boss of the Bonanno crime family, Philip Rusty Rustelli. She became a suspect in a fraud case where the mobsters diverted money intended for AIDS research. She was investigated by the FBI for possible perjury and obstruction of justice. According to reports, she told investigators that she knew nothing about the scheme, but they didn't believe her. She was never charged with a crime, but her marriage to a mobster made her a target of the authorities. No. 3. Karen Gravano. She is the daughter of Salvatore Gravano, aka Sammy the Bull, who was one of the biggest informants against the mafia. He helped bring down many mobsters, including John Gotti. Karen became famous when she testified against her father in court. She said that he ordered the murder of 6 people, and she wanted him to pay for what he did. She was one of the witnesses in the case that led to her father's conviction for racketeering and murder. She admitted that she was disappointed in her father for the things he had done, but she felt like she had no choice but to testify against him. No. 2. Rosalie Punzo. She is the daughter of Anthony Fat Tony Dukes, who was once the boss of the Gambino crime family. She grew up in a luxurious mansion in Queens, New York, and was used to living a life of privilege. However, everything changed when her father was arrested on fraud charges. She had to move in with her grandparents and attend public school instead of private schools. She became a hairdresser after dropping out of high school and was even arrested for stealing tips from her customers. Despite her difficult childhood, she became a successful businesswoman and opened her own beauty salon. No one. Angela Amato. She is the widow of Francesco Amato, who was the boss of the Lucchese crime family. She inherited a huge fortune when her husband died because he had stashed away over $1 million in cash. She lived in a beautiful mansion in Westchester County, New York. The mansion had 37 rooms, including 9 bathrooms and a wine cellar with a capacity of 10,000 bottles. When the police searched the house, they also found a gun safe, bulletproof glass, hidden panels, secret passageways, false walls, and even an underground tunnel leading to a garage. They also discovered forged documents and over $1 million in cash. The prosecutor said this was one of the biggest hoards of cash ever found in connection with a mafia investigation. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Today we are going to discuss Mistresses vs. Queens. Which one would you rather be? If you were to choose, I have to be honest. I think I'd choose Mistress because that means that you are in charge. You are the person that everyone looks up to. You are the leader. And even though there is a queen, right? She is not in charge. She doesn't hold any power. She is just sitting there looking pretty. So I would definitely want to be the mistress. What about you? Which one would you rather be? A mistress is the female head of a household in medieval Europe, typically the wife of a lord or a king, while a queen is the wife of a king. Do you know what they have in common? They are both very powerful women. In medieval Europe, they both held high status in society and had the potential to wield great influence over their husbands and the kingdom as a whole. However, despite their similarities, these two roles were fundamentally different. While queens were typically chosen for their lineage and ability to produce heirs, mistresses could come from a variety of social backgrounds, while queens were almost always related to the king through blood or marriage. The role of mistress began in the early medieval period, when the concept of courtly love was developed. This was a time when knights were expected to be brave and chivalrous and to demonstrate their loyalty to their lords and ladies. A mistress was the perfect foil to this culture, as she was the one who set the standard for behavior and could bestow the ultimate reward on a knight her favor. As such, mistresses were typically skilled in the arts of seduction and diplomacy. They needed to be able to charm and manipulate those around them in order to maintain their position of power. Queens were expected to be pious and virtuous women who could bear children and uphold the honor of the kingdom. They did not typically have the same level of power as mistresses, but they did have a lot of responsibility. In the High Middle Ages, the power of mistresses began to decline as the feudal system became more centralized, and the role of the monarch became more important. The power struggle between mistresses and queens was inevitable. On one hand, queens were seen as the epitome of feminine perfection, chosen by God himself to be the wife of the king and the mother of the next generation of rulers. They were respected and revered by their subjects and had a certain mystique about them. Their position gave them a certain power and authority, and they were often involved in the political affairs of the kingdom. As you can see, both mistresses and queens were powerful women in medieval European history. However, their power came from different sources and was used in different ways. Queens use their power to maintain the honor of the kingdom and to secure the future of the dynasty. Mistresses use their power to pursue their own interests and to gain the favor of their lovers. There were many famous mistresses and queens throughout medieval European history. Some of the most famous mistresses include Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was the mistress of France before she became Queen of England. Who was the mistress of England before she became Queen of France? And Mary, Queen of Scots, who was the mistress of Scotland before she became Queen of France. Some of the most famous queens include Isabella of Castile, who was the Queen of Spain, Elizabeth I of England, and Victoria of the United Kingdom. Despite their differences, there were also some similarities between mistresses and queens. Both were typically well-educated and knew how to use their intelligence to their advantage. So which one would you rather be? A mistress or a queen? Now let us go back in time to learn more about the lives of these two fascinating types of medieval women. In the Middle Ages, the mistress of a house was the woman in charge. The mistress of a house was typically a widow or a divorcee. This was because the Catholic Church did not allow for remarriage after a divorce. Therefore, a woman who had been divorced had no choice but to live with her father or brother. As such, it was common for the mistress of a house to be an older woman who had more life experience than her younger female relatives. The mistress of a house had several responsibilities. This included her sons, daughters, servants, and any other members of her extended family who might be living with her. She had to make sure that everyone behaved appropriately and followed the rules of her household. Additionally, the mistress of a house was responsible for the upkeep of her home. This meant that she had to make sure it was clean and tidy at all times, and that any repairs that needed to be done were carried out quickly. She had to make sure that everyone had enough to eat and wear, and that they were always dressed appropriately for the occasion. Being the mistress of a house was not an easy job. It required a lot of hard work and dedication, but it was also very rewarding. The mistress of a house had the satisfaction of knowing that she was running a tight ship and that her family and servants respected and obeyed her. She is often involved in the political affairs of the kingdom and may even have her own court. Queens are usually very wealthy and live in palaces. They are also expected to bear children and produce heirs for the king. Queenship is often hereditary, meaning that the queen's children will become king and queen when the current king and queen die. In medieval Europe, queens were typically very powerful figures. Queens were also responsible for bearing children and producing heirs. This was because it was believed that the legitimacy of the royal line depended on the queen's ability to produce a male heir. Queens were often very busy women. They had to juggle the demands of their husband, the court, and their family. Queenship was a difficult role to fill, but it was also a very rewarding one. Queens had the opportunity to shape the future of their kingdom and to leave a lasting legacy. They were also at the center of the royal court and had the opportunity to meet and interact with some of the most interesting people in the kingdom. So which one would you rather be, a mistress or a queen? Personally, I think I'd rather be a queen. Being the most powerful woman in the kingdom would be pretty cool, not to mention all the bling. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, then please like and subscribe for more fun history videos. Thanks for watching. Philip II of Spain had his eye on the throne of France, and he was ungoing to let a little thing like being married to a 16-year-old girl stop him from getting it. Hello everyone, welcome to this house. Today we are exploring the stunning palace of Fontainebleau in France, where we will look at the bedroom of one of Henry VIII's mistresses, Gabrielle D., who became queen in everything but name. Make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an exciting episode. Though born into relative obscurity in 1547 or 1548, Gabrielle had striking features. Having inherited her mother's dark, shiny hair and dazzling complexion, her father was a simple farmer with a noble title, Seigneur d'Estrie, from which she took her surname. While not as elevated as some members of the French nobility, they were well connected enough to be noticed when Gabrielle and her 4 sisters came of age and were presented at court. Henry II, Duke of brother of Francis I and uncle of Henry III, first noticed Gabrielle at age 13 when she was part of a group of ladies attending the French Queen Isabella of the House of Austria. He reportedly became enamored with the young girl and began corresponding with her through letters, a large number of which have survived to this day. These letters, however, do not paint a rosy picture of their relationship. The Duke is often cold, aloof, and even insulting towards her. It's clear that while he has taken a shine to Gabrielle, he isn't overly interested in cultivating a relationship. Unfortunately, this would change upon the death of his wife, Louise of Savoy, in 1553, as well as his own wife, Eleanor of Portugal, 2 years later. Now, free to pursue his own desires, he showered Gabrielle with attention, affection, and gifts, though whether or not this was enough for her is questionable. When the king visited her family home in 1555, he found her unresponsive to his advances and felt humiliated. To make matters worse, news arrived that day that Francis I had made his son, the Dauphin Duke, of officially ending his own reign under that title and severely damaging his pride. In retaliation, he decided to use the powers of the crown to force Gabrielle into submission. He arranged for her father to be given a peerage, along with other titles and lands, and threatened to withdraw them if she did not agree to become his mistress. Though there was no wedding, the arrangement was official. By refusing her hand in marriage, Henry had managed to trap Gabrielle into a situation where she could not marry anyone else, but also had no hope of becoming queen. And so she accepted his proposal, giving the king what he wanted, while her father received his reward. Not long after, Gabrielle fell pregnant and gave birth to Diane de Poitiers, who would go on to become one of Henry's mistresses, though never his wife. This fact did not go unnoticed by the king, who referred to her as his bastard daughter. Interestingly, he also referred to Gabrielle as his bastard wife, though whether or not this was a term of endearment or a cutting jab is unknown. As time passed, Gabrielle bore Henry 5 more children, 3 of whom died in infancy or early childhood. His constant infidelities irritated her, and she spent much of her time alone, seeking solace in writing poetry, painting, hunting, and hawking. She was particularly fond of horses and was said to be skilled in riding and managing them. Though her father had hoped his daughter's relationship with the king would help elevate the family, it actually had the opposite effect. Those around the king viewed her as a threat, and she was continually being undermined. Her position at court was never secure, and she was frequently sent away from Paris, sometimes for months at a time. By 1560, she had grown tired of her situation and wished to leave the king and marry one of her suitors, the de Montespan. He had been her lover before Henry took the throne and was now offering her a way out of her prison-like existence. When the king discovered her plans, he became enraged and imprisoned her in the fortress of Eusin, forbidding her from leaving the premises or seeing any visitors. Even her father was forbidden to visit her. With nowhere to turn for support, Gabrielle became seriously ill and was forced to call upon a physician. The following year, 1561, Henry finally agreed to grant her a divorce, and she left the kingdom with her 6-year-old son, marrying Montespan shortly thereafter. The king kept her children with him, officially legitimizing them in 1566, though only 2 survived to adulthood. Though relieved to be free of her former captor, Gabrielle's troubles were far from over. She and Montespan had 2 sons together, but he died in 1569, leaving her as a 21-year-old widow once more. Once again, she had several suitors, including the men she had previously rejected, the Duc de Guise and the Duc de Nemours. Eventually, she chose the latter, marrying him in secret. But when Henry VIII heard about the union, he immediately had the marriage annulled, claiming that as Gabrielle had once been his wife, he could not permit another man to be joined to her. In need of a new plan, she turned to Catherine de' Medici, Henry's wife and close friend of hers from before the king's rise to power. Catherine had been remarkably patient with Gabrielle over the years, showing her kindness and compassion when the king had been cruel and unfeeling. In return, Gabrielle had been loyal to Catherine, never betraying her or speaking against her, despite the fact that she had every opportunity to do so, and now Catherine was willing to help. She requested that Henry grant Gabrielle's new husband the title of Duke of Chaulnes, which he did. This act may have seemed generous, but it was actually an old trick of Catherine's. When Henry granted a noble title, he always made it conditional on the recipient renouncing all rights of inheritance for himself and his descendants. Therefore, Gabrielle's son with Nemours would never have a claim to the throne, nor would any future children she bore. Unfazed, Gabrielle went ahead with the marriage and secretly bore Henry a daughter in 1572, followed by a son 2 years later. Her life was comfortable enough, and she spent her days raising her children, hunting and enjoying the company of her friends. But it was all she could do to hide the disappointment she felt at not being able to secure a better future for herself and her family. She knew she had been foolish to leave the king, as no one else could ever treat her the way he did. No matter how bad things had gotten, she still had some sway with him and was summoned to his bedside when he lay dying. At this point, he was completely blind, and Gabrielle stayed with him throughout the night, reading him poetry and praying with him. Upon his death, she left his side to go change into black clothing, hoping to be seen as a devoted and caring woman. But Henry's widow was not fooled. She knew full well that Gabrielle had only appeared at the king's deathbed to pay her respects to him and secure her place in history. As a result, Catherine banned Gabrielle from attending the funeral. In the following years, Gabrielle acted humbly and waited patiently for Catherine to pass away. With the death of the king and his wife, her son, Henry III, came to power and immediately set about undoing some of his father's mistakes. One of these was the annulment of Gabrielle's marriage to Nemours. He allowed the couple to wed once more, granting their children legitimacy and securing them a place in line for the throne. But Gabrielle's happiness was short-lived. A civil war broke out between the Catholics and the Huguenots, a group of French Protestants. Gabrielle and Nemours sided with the Catholics, leading to the siege of Rochelle in 1573, though the city eventually fell. They were forced to flee, ending up in Paris without any money or possessions. Fortunately, her son was able to buy back her former estate, Château d'Estrie, and the family moved there, living modestly. With the outbreak of the French Wars of Religion, Gabrielle's son had converted to Calvinism and was fighting on the Protestant side. Though her marriage had been restored, she and Nemours never had any more children. And when her son was killed in battle in 1589, Gabrielle died of a broken heart just 2 weeks later. She was buried in the church of Saint Ludussin, next to her son and his wife. Today, there are no remains of Gabrielle's former mistress wing at the Palace of Fontainebleau, as it was demolished sometime after the French Revolution. What is interesting, however, is that in 1864, during renovations, the workers discovered a stone tablet bearing the date 1574 and the names Gabrielle and Nemours carved into it. Many believe it once marked their tomb, which could explain why her body was never recovered. This intriguing artifact can now be found in the garden of the palace, hidden amongst the shrubs and vines. I hope you enjoyed this look at the life of Henry VIII's mistress, who was queen in everything but name. Which room was your favorite? Let me know down below in the comments section. And while you're there, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an exciting episode. I would also like to take a moment to say a special thank you to our supporters whose names you can see on screen right now. I'll see you next time.